easy to think about, okay, why they have different kinds of dispersion and distribution patterns. But for landscape, we need to think about why they become that way. It could be natural, and it could be modified by human. So there are many ways to look at it. So normally we have three types. One is clumped, one is uniform, and one is graded. And as we mentioned, just because they have different reasons to form a specific landscape, therefore some like building, they may be like more like this, or the road system. A lot of times they follow the grid system or follow the topography. So they will have certain shape just because some reasons behind it. So normally how we calculate using a number to know that the dispersion pattern is through the variance of the mean nearest neighbor distance. That means if we have for this example, every time you pick one and the distance between this one to the nearest neighbor is actually the same for each patch. So when you do that, when you calculate the variance will be very low because the numbers, the mean nearest distance is very close to each other. But for this one, some are very close, some are far away, so the variance will increase. So we can use the variance of this value to judge, okay, what kind of distribution they are over all the different patches. So that's a quite common techniques that people use. Another group of them is adjacency. Okay, adjacency is a term that can be sometimes be used together with contingent. So those two phrases are basically talking about the chance that a certain type of patch are always close to another type. So from the human perspective or the landscape perspective, you will find that, okay, the building normally will be beside the road because you need a road to build a building. So that's the tendency that you will find a building that always close to the road. But there are other patterns may not be the same. So it depends. Sometimes the wetland, for example, a lot of people would like to live by the beach or by the lake. So that's a lakefront property, lakefront building. So that's what people like. So you will also see that the wetland and the building may sometimes be close to each other. And I use this movie poster as an example to show what it means by contention. So based on the name, you will know that it's probably a contagious disease that will spread. And that's a story about that in the human context. But then the English name they're using is contagion, so it's very similar to what we're using here. And that just showing you how, if I'm very close to a person, and the chance your virus or the disease can spread out or increase. So the higher the density, the higher the chance that it is spread out. So it's more like this, the contagion, but in the landscape context, we normally talk about different probabilities that the animal can move from one to another, things like that, and then we can use that as a concept. So think about this. For this A, B, and 3 landscape, they actually have the same percentage, proportion of each tower type. But they are kind of mismatched. For the first one, you notice that it's very diverse, very mosaic. But for the landscape C, you will find that they have a larger patch. So if you look at this, you can probably see that, okay, maybe I'll use this example. you'll see that the yellow ones are always closer to the purple one. Right? Anywhere they go, the yellow one always next by the purple one. So that means those two types are always connected with each other. So that's kind of the adjacency or contention that we try to use. So we want to know that the distribution of different color types, are they just simply random, or they can actually have some kind of reason for them to form a certain pattern. So this is this group of configuration that we normally use as a matrix. So I want to also repeat and emphasize that when we talk about all these different matrices, they are actually, we need to first make sure that what kind of levels of heterogeneity we are talking about. Like the first one we talked about is more about the patch. And then if we concern all the patches in this color type, and then we are at a different level. So this is the patch level index. And then a lot of the time, you can calculate a certain matrix with this level and also with landscape level. So you need to really have those ideas in mind to make sure that you understand the metrics, because they will just give you a calculation. Okay, for example, dominance index, or sometimes mirrors distance of something, and then you need to make sure that both of them will have a similar name, but one is for class and one is for landscape. And this is something very important, and it's actually very easy to be confused. So that's what I want to focus on. So we talk about composition. That's just the proportion. We don't know where they are. And then we talk about configuration. That's normally involved with how they connected to each other. And then there are different patterns, different aspects that we can try to describe a certain landscape. But that involves the location, that is where they are. And the connectivity is another very important aspect in landscape ecology metrics, because it actually involved in both composition and configuration, but it is kind of very important enough, so it kind of can be its own category that people normally focus on this. So the connectivity is, the definition is really simple: the state or extent of being connected or interconnected. So whether or not a lot of the patches, the same types, are connected with each other, or they are actually spread out, and then whether they have like corridors to connect between all the patches. So, for example, this is a sentence is for a grammatical explanation. Authorities work at restoring connectivities between Puerto Rico and the U.S. after a hurricane. So the connection is that, okay, before it is that there's no problem going back and forth between those two places, but now there's some destruction, and so we want to reconnect that. And for animals, you can also think about that way. So in Chinese, it's just a 连接性共同性, in a way it can be used. Okay. So if you look at some definition from for a landscape ecology definition, it says it's a degree to which the landscape facilitate or impede movement. Does everyone know the word impede? Well, based on the origin of the first two letters, you know that that's actually a negative word, and PED is feet. So that means it's hard to move from one place to another. So to facilitate, that means it helps the animals to go from one place to the other, and the other one is actually harder for them to go. So the connectivity is kind of a series of metrics that we use to describe the this kind of thing, and that is very, very important to animals. And sometimes we also need to make sure that what we are doing now for connectivity is to create some metrics, right? So that's a number. It'll just give you a number, and you can compare that. Okay, for this connectivity, for this kind of landscape, the connectivity is maybe 2, and the other one is 1.5. But that's just a number. That doesn't really mean that the animals can really move from one place to another. So a lot of time we also will have to focus on whether or not this connectivity is functional. Okay, this is a chance it will go from one place to another, but it is really true, or it is just a calculation numbers that from the landscape, from the metrics that we're trying to calculate. So this is things that we need to have in the back of our mind. And also the connectivity, it depending on the process of interest. So if now we're saying the movement, one animal move from one place to another, it could be seed dispersal, right? The seeds move from the mother tree to another places that may or may not be good for the seedling to germinate. So it really depending on what we're talking about. For animals, different animals, things like the corridor, whether or not the corridor actually functions depending on the species, depending on the process of interest. So for all of these different types of connectivity metrics, it sometimes based on a strict adjacency. And what I'm saying is that they connected to different types of cover type. Okay? Or there are some threshold distance. That means, okay, I like the forest, but I can sometimes go out to the grassland. And then as long as there are some forest there as well, I can just, run fast. So I can go from one place to another safely. So sometimes, so the threshold distance is, if you consider the functional part of this matrix, it is a very critical number. But the problem is, how do we know the threshold number? So actually, you can do experiment. For example, this is a forest, and then that's a grassland, and then you can try to release an animal to see where they go, whether or not they move from here to there, and you can change the distance, and then to get that number. But you will know that it's not really practical to do things like that. But it is doable. So a lot of time we need to guess, what's the threshold distance might be. And so for some cases, in this concept, you will think that if we only need to consider adjacency, that would be very easy. That's a distance of 0. But if the threshold distance maybe go up to 100 meters, or the distance actually will be depending on the types, the cover type. If it's a grass, okay, or it's a bare ground, okay, or if it's okay, if it's a road or some man-made structure. So it depends. So that's why we need to remember that. And we will talk about this later, that if we are using this as a breed system, so let's say there's an animal in this suitable habitat here. And if we consider the adjacency, that means they can only go for these 4 cells. But sometimes, so that means this will be a unit that animals can go from one place to another. But you may say that some animals can go this way as well. Or can they go like this? So this is a suitable habitat, and this is not. But because it's only one cell, so maybe to 30 meters in reality. So the animals can still go. So there are different rules that we will talk about later. Some people using the 4 neighbor rule. 1, 2, 3, 4. That means they have to connect to each other so that they can move from one cell to another. Some people using the 8 cell rule, that they include the corners. But other people using get another 4, that means 12 cell neighbor rule. And then you will have different ways to calculate based on the threshold distance and redefine it first. But we will have some practice and for you to understand that how likely for one animal to move to another cell based on that. So here we mentioned that some decreasing function of distance that reflect the probability of connection at a given distance. Okay? So if the distance increase, the likelihood will decrease. So the problem is, what's the shape for that relationship? So normally it's hard to know, but there are ways we can try to model and to give it a better idea. So here I want to re-emphasize this again. It's a structural connectivity that's just based on what we see, and then functional connectivity based on some other ideas of the animal's ecology that we need to understand first before we know that whether or not those two are the same. Most of the time, the functional connectivity is more strict. It's a higher standard, but structural connectivity is like, okay, I build something for you. You should be able to go, but whether or not the animals will go, it depends. So that's the differences between those two. And the hard thing is really difficult to measure, but that's something we all need to do. And actually for the structural or functional measures, again, you can easily calculate some index or some metrics. It can be related to edge contrast, it can be the interior species, like the edge influence zone, or the ecological neighbors ideas. And for almost all the metrics, we can always look at the structure and the functional. Structure is very easy. We will do a lot of calculation to practice, and that's the structure. But whether or not the animals will really follow that is a question mark, and that's something we also practice. Okay. So you will see later on that actually there are more than one, or sometimes more than hundreds of metrics. That just have a little bit difference on some aspect, and then they all try to describe something. So for composition, configuration, and connectivity, there are just over hundreds of metrics. We will talk about maybe 2 or 3 per category later. So just to give you an idea what we can use if we really need to work on to try to include the landscape variable in your thesis or in your work, then the job is to, okay, what's the most important thing? Why I need this kind of metrics? What aspect we need to look at it? Okay. And the problem for choosing one, normally the indexes, because most of them are correlated. Just I mentioned, they're just changing one aspect, change a little bit. So if they are all correlated, then we need to separate them and then to really know their relationship first, because before we put all the landscape variables into those big models. Then we will give you some example and talk about later. So for this is from one paper, and they recommend 5 most commonly used metrics, and that's different people will have different ideas about what's the most important one. So some people think that the patch area, parameter and area ratio is a very important thing. That's regarding the shape, right? And something people think that for the image textures, that means the contention index based on whether or not they are likely to move or to pass from one cover type to another. We'll talk about that as an example. And some people think that the hash area, know how round they are, is an important index. But I mentioned this is from this author, but many different people have different ideas. And some people think that the hash parameter area scaling, that means the size, the actual size compared to its ratio, may also be important because there are a lot of animals that require large area to live. So from a smaller area to a larger area, normally it's not linear. The relation is not linear. It's kind of curvature in some way. So that's why we need to understand that idea. And then this is the last one is the hash ratios. It's also something that, including the proportion, that's something. I think actually the fifth one is the most common one that people use, and you will see in all kinds of thesis or scientific paper that use landscape ecology. And so you will know that okay, all these are related to composition, right? And configuration, some people use it, but it is because it is more complicated. So sometimes there are fewer people try to include that. But either way, you will need to really need to know what they mean and whether or not they fit what you need. This is a question I want to ask. So what would be the best set of the variables or metrics that is important? So normally when after people get all these variables they use, they get a number, right? And all these information are not spatially explicit. That means they're just numbers. We don't know where they are, where those numbers are. So following this is a trend for the future. That people try to create some statistics method or a spatial modeling method that incorporates spatial ideas. For example, if you use all the techniques and to get maybe 5 landscape variables, and then you will use those maybe to in a generalized linear model or a regression. That's still a traditional analysis, right? The analysis itself is not spatially explicit. So a lot of people should create that. Again, those spatial statistics are a lot more complex and then require some computer techniques to be able to do that. So we will also touch a little bit on what kind of types of spatial statistics we can use. And if later on somebody needs it, you can go search for it. The main differences between the traditional or the regular statistics versus the spatial ones is that for all the regular statistics, we actually assume that there are no correlation because of how close they are with each other. And this we will talk about a little bit more as well. It's normally called autocorrelation. So this is a correlation, but the auto part means that if you are close to you, more likely the variables will be close to each other. The further the distance, the less likely your numbers will be the same. So you can consider autocorrelation when you actually want to do some analysis. And that's actually more powerful tools to use. But sometimes the traditional ones is actually assuming the stationary. That means it doesn't matter how far you are with each other, it should be random. Right? Those assumptions that we normally use for regular focus on other aspects. Okay, so this is the first part. Let's do the exercise first.